The family history portion of how Jehovah God made me the man that I am were primarily my parents, the late Clarence Taylor Sr., and my mother, the late Bertha Gibson Taylor Dingle, as well as 8 of my 9 older siblings, all of whom, as I'll explain later, are much older than I am, with vivid recollections of our upbringing. Of course, the family history portion of how Jehovah God made me the man that I am naturally begins with my parents, the late Clarence Taylor Sr. and the late Bertha Gibson Taylor Dingle, both of whom were born in the southeast of the United States in the year 1918. And like most African Americans, they of course were extremely hardworking, being raised as sharecroppers. But they also inherited from their parents and passed down to their children an extremely strong work ethic, as well as an entrepreneurial spirit and a tendency towards self-sufficiency. My mother's father was not content to remain a sharecropper the rest of his life. So, in what must have been considered extraordinary for that time, the early 20th century, in the South at that, he, as an African American, managed to purchase many acres of land apparently in an area of South Carolina that today is considered to be resort areas. And sadly, however, when the time came for my grandfather, my mother's father, to make the final payment on his property, he was busy working in his fields, on his crops, and entrusted a friend to make his final payment on his property. And as can be imagined, that so-called friend apparently skipped town and disappeared with the final payment for my grandfather's property, which can also easily be imagined, especially to an African American at that time, that enabled certain people to quickly seize my grandfather's property. My mother often painfully recalled looking out of the window of their small home after her father, my grandfather, was told that his land was going to be taken from him, and seeing her father, my grandfather, standing alone in his field, or in what used to be his field, apparently talking to himself or praying and or crying and waving his hands in mourning the loss of his land and the loss of his dream for himself and his family. And as my mother often recalled and informed her children, including myself, her father, my grandfather, was never the same. My mother's mother, Catherine Gibson, was apparently the spiritual pillar of my mother's side of the family. And she came to be the pastor of 2 churches and congregations, one in their hometown of Summerton, South Carolina, and the other in New York City. My father's father was tragically killed in an auto accident when my father was a young child. Reportedly, he was standing on the back of a work truck with several other workers when it overturned, crushing him and reportedly decapitating him. As the story goes, the authorities placed his head in a bucket and brought it to my father's home for my father's mother, my grandmother on my father's side, to identify her deceased husband. My father's mother, Annie, was a full-blooded Cherokee Indian, which thus made my father one half Cherokee Indian, and his children, including myself, 1/4 Cherokee Indian.